There is a padlock I will remember until the day I die. Hand-forged iron, gone the color of a wet stone, hanging from a hasp my grandfather hammered out himself on a snowy afternoon the year I was born. For 2 years after he passed, that lock kept his workshop sealed at the top of our hill in Mitchell County, North Carolina, and not one of us was allowed past it. My stepmother said the shed was full of junk. She said the old man had wasted his life on firewood with strings, and that when she finally got around to it, she'd haul the whole mess to the burn pile and be done with it. She was wrong about almost everything, but she was most wrong about that. I was 16 the winter. She put my little brother and me out of the only home we'd ever known. Eli was 12. We stood at the bottom of the porch steps in the cold with everything we owned stuffed into feed sacks, watching our breath cloud up in front of us. And I remember thinking that the saddest thing in the world is a house that still has your handwriting on the doorframe, but no longer wants you inside it. I didn't cry. I wouldn't give her that. I just took my brother's hand, and we walked down the frozen ruts of our own driveway toward the road. And behind us the mountain stood there the way it always had, patient and enormous, and keeping it secret. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what was behind that padlock, you have to understand my grandfather first, because everything that ever saved us came out of his hands. His name was Asa Vance, and he was a luthier. That's a fancy word for a man who builds stringed instruments. And I didn't even know it was a proper name for what he did until I was nearly grown, because nobody in our holly used it. They just said, Asa makes guitars, the way you'd say a man makes barns or shoes horses, like it was an ordinary trade, and not something close to magic. He'd learned it as a boy from a German fellow who'd settled over near Spruce Pine before the First War, an old craftsman with no children of his own who'd seen something in a quiet mountain boy and handed him a chisel instead of a hoe. Asa spent the next 60 years bent over a bench in that shed, turning flat pieces of spruce and walnut and rosewood into things that could make a grown man cry across a room. Our place was 84 acres of steep mountain ground in the Tow River Valley, most of it too vertical to do much with. Van Cess had farmed that hill since before the county had a courthouse, since before the roads were paved, since back when getting to town meant a full day on a mule. We grew burley tobacco in the bottom by the creek for as long as anybody could count, ran a few goats, kept a kitchen garden that fed us through the winters in mason jars lined up like soldiers on the cellar shelves. There was a smokehouse my great-grandfather built, and a spring house where the water ran so cold in August it would ache your teeth, and a barn with a hayloft where Eli and I played our whole imaginary lives on rainy afternoons. But the heart of the farm wasn't the tobacco or the goats or the barn. It was a workshop. People came from as far as Tennessee and Kentucky, and once, I swear it's true, all the way from a city in Japan, just to climb our hill and buy a guitar from an old man who answered the door in suspenders with shavings caught in his eyebrows. I was the one who took to it. Eli was a Creek-in-Trees boy, happiest with a fishing line and a pocket full of crawdads, but from the time I could walk I'd sit on Grandpa's bench while he worked, breathing in the smell of hide glue warming on the little hot plate, and the sharp clean sweetness of shellac, and he'd hand down curls of spruce shaving for me to play with like they were Christmas ribbon. I learned to shop the way other children learn a nursery rhyme, by heart, before I even understood it. I knew the wooden joiner plane by its sound, the long SSSH gave it taking a shaving off a top, and I knew the dozens of clamps hanging by size on a wall, and I knew the jars of hide glue and the cans of varnish lying on the high shelf, and the little jeweler's sawy use of fine work, and the smell of the place, which I could find blindfolded in the dark to this day, and which I believe I will smell on my last breath. By the time I was 10, he was letting me clamp braces while the glue set. By 12, I could file a fret and dress the ends so smooth they'd never catch the heel of your hand. By 14, I was doing his inlay, the delicate stuff, the mother of pearl and the abalone, because he said my fingers were younger than his and steadier than they had any right to be. He'd watch me cut a little curl of pearl with a jeweler's saw, holding my breath the way he taught me so the line stayed true, and when I'd done it right he'd go quiet, which from Grandpa was the highest praise there was. He wasn't a man for saying, "Good job." He'd just look at the work, and look at me, and nod once, slow, and that nod was worth more than 100 speeches. He didn't talk much. That a thing about mountain people the rest of the world gets wrong. Folks think quiet means simple, when most often it means a man is choosing his words, because he's only got so many and doesn't aim to waste a one. The things Grandpa said, he said once, and he said them while his hands kept moving. Wood remembers, he told me one time, playing the top of guitar, so thin you could see the lamplight glowing through it. Tree stood on a mountain 100 years, feeling the wind, drinking the rain. You build it right, it never forgets how to sing. Another time, when I was rushing a job and split a piece of binding, he didn't scold me. He just picked up the broken piece and turned it over in those big scarred hands and said, "Can't hurry wood, Wren. Can't hurry much, that's worth a thing." And he set me to making a new piece, slow, and stood there until I did it right. He glued a little paper label inside every instrument he ever made, written in his own slow, careful hand, his name, the town, the year, and a number, because he'd built them in order his whole life, and he knew exactly which one he was on. He never advertised, never had a sign. The work spoke, and word carried, and that was enough for him. People who knew told other people who knew. And they found their way up our hill, and they left with something they'd hand down to their grandchildren. I used to watch them play the new instrument out on the porch before they drove off. See a man's face change when he heard the first chord, and I understood even as a little girl that my grandfather wasn't selling guitars. He was selling a piece of the mountain that would outlive everybody who touched it. My grandmother died before I have any memory of her, so it had always been just Grandpa up the hill, alone with his work and his coffee. And the radio, he kept tuned to the gospel station on Sundays. My mother, Lila, died when I was 9 and Eli was 5, a sickness that took her fast in the fall, between the last cutting of tobacco and the first hard frost. So quick that I have only a handful of memories of her, and I hoard them like coins. After there was my daddy, Wade, and the two of us kids, and Grandpa. Daddy was a good man hollowed out by grief. He'd been a strong worker once, the kind who could put a full day into tobacco and then split a cordwood before supper. But losing Mama broke something in him that never set right, and he started leaning on the bottle, the way a man leans on a fence post he knows good and well is rotten. He didn't get mean with it. He just got further away, a little more every year, until it felt like talking to him across a wide, cold creek. Grandpa held us together those years. He'd come down the house every single evening with something he'd made, a willow whistle, a little 3-legged stool, a doll's chair he'd built me out of cherry scrap with a tiny woven seat, and he'd sit with Daddy on the porch and not say much, just be there, which I have learned since it's the rarest and best kind of medicine there is. Then Grandpa died. He was 81. And he went the way a craftsman ought to, in his sleep after a full day at the bench, with an unfinished mandolin still in the clamps and his coffee cup gone cold on a windowsill where the morning light hit it. I was 14. Losing him was like losing the floor of the house. The whole place felt tilted afterward, like a building settled wrong, and the worst part, the part one couldn't say out loud to anybody, was knowing that the last steady thing holding our family upright had just been taken out from under us. Now it was only Daddy who was sinking, and the bottle, which is the most patient thing on earth. Daddy lasted 2 more years. By the second of them, he'd married Sondra. I want to be fair about Sondra, even now, because being fair is something my grandfather taught me with that same patient quiet, and I've tried hard to keep it. She wasn't from the mountains. She came up from down around Charlotte, a hard-faced, bright lipstick woman who'd waited tables and worked a cosmetics counter and survived 2 husbands before my daddy. And somewhere along the way, she learned the hard lesson that you grab whatever's in reach because nobody is ever going to hand you a thing. I understand that better now than I did then. But understanding why a person is sharp doesn't unmake the cuts. And she cut us deep. She met Daddy at the feed store in town. And what she saw, I think, was a lonely man with land and a house and no one minding his money. And she moved herself inside of 3 months. From the first week, she walked our farm the way an auctioneer walks an estate sale. Calculating, sorting, deciding in her head what was worth keeping and what was trash to be hauled off. And the very first thing she decided was trash, before she'd been there a month, was the workshop. That falling down shed, she called it, with her nose wrinkled like it smelled. She could not get over the idea that Asa Vance had spent a whole life making, in her exact words, fancy firewood, when he could have logged off the timber on the back 40 or leased a tobacco bottom to a bigger grower. She didn't understand, couldn't understand, because no one ever told her, that anyone with guitars hanging in that shed was worth more money than every standing tree on the mountain. Nobody had told her, because nobody knew to. Daddy never had the head for business, and never asked what the instruments fetched. Grandpa had never bragged a day in his life. It actually embarrassed him to talk dollars about something he'd have done for the pure love of it. So Sondra walked past the fortune every single day for 2 years and saw nothing but a chore she hadn't gotten around to yet. A dusty old eyesore she meant to clear off the property the first chance she got. She started in on Daddy about selling the whole place. There was a developer buying up mountain tracts to put vacation cabins on, the kind of fellow who'd never set foot in a tobacco row in his life, and he'd pay good money. She said real money, and they could move down off the mountain to somewhere with a flat yard and a paved drive and a Walmart close by. Daddy would just nod into his cup and not answer. He didn't have it in him to fight her, and he didn't have it in him to leave the hill where Mama was buried, either. So he did the thing that hollowed-out men do, which is nothing at all, and let the pressure build behind a dam that everybody but him could see was bowing and about to give. What none of us knew, what Sondra never once imagined, was that my grandfather had seen her coming. Not her, exactly, not by name. But he'd seen the shape of trouble a long way off. The way he could lay his eye on a green board and tell you exactly how it would warp and check in 10 years' time. And quietly, telling not one living soul in the family, old Asa Vance had done something about it. He'd built a thing as carefully and as far in advance as he built everything, and he'd left it sealed in the dark, waiting. The dam gave the spring I turned 16. Daddy's heart quit on him in the night. 49 years old, worn out a quarter-century before his time. We buried him beside Mama in a little fenced plot at the edge of the woods where 4 generations of ancestors lay under the dogwoods, and Sondra stood at the graveside in a new black coat and did not shed a tear that I could see. I held Eli's hand hard, and I felt the ground till under us, because even at 16 I knew that the only thing standing between us and Sondra now was Sondra's mercy, and in 2 years I had never once seen her show a drop of it. It took her 11 days. I'll tell you exactly how it happened, because I've gone over it 10,000 times in my mind, and the details have never once blurred. It was a Tuesday, cold for spring. A late frost had killed the apple blossoms and laid a white rime over the new grass. I came home from school, walked up the drive with my book bag on my shoulder the way I had 10,000 other days, and Eli's and my belongings were piled out on the porch. Everything the two of us owned jammed into burlap feed sacks and 2 cardboard liquor boxes, the kind that came from Daddy's habit, which I have always believed she chose on purpose to wound. Sondra was standing in the doorway in her coat with her arms crossed tight, and there was a man I didn't know sitting in a pickup in the driveway with the engine running and a trailer hooked behind it. "You're 16, she said the second I got close, like that one word settled everything there was to settle. Old enough to make your own way in this world. This is my house now. Wade's gone, and I'm his widow, and everything yet comes to me, the land, the house, the whole works. I've been more than patient with the 2 of you." She looked at me the way you look at something stuck to your shoe. "You're not my blood, and you never were. I'm not about to raise another woman's children. There's a county home that'll take you, or you've got people somewhere. Go on and find them. The truck's leaving in 20 minutes, and I want you gone before it does." Eli's chin started to crumple, and the tears came up in his eyes, and I squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt, because I had decided in that exact instant that whatever else she took from us that day, she would not get to watch us break. I kept my voice flat and even, and I asked her, polite as Sunday, if I could please go in and get the rest of my school books from my room. She said no. She said the truck was waiting and the man had already been paid to start clearing out the shed today, and she wanted us off the property before he so much as started. And then she said the thing I have never forgiven and never forgotten, the thing that I think, in the strange arithmetic of grief, ended up saving us, though she could never have known it. She jerked her chin up the hill toward the workshop and said, "And take a good last look at your grandpa's junk pile while you're at it, because come tomorrow it's a bonfire. Lord knows it's the only useful thing that worthless old was ever been good for." Behind her, up the hill, I could see the man climbing out of his truck with a pair of long-handled bolt cutters in his fist, starting up toward the workshop, toward a hand-forged iron hasp and the padlock my grandfather had hammered out the year I was born. I want you to understand what I had in that moment. Standing in the frost, I had nothing, No mother, no father, no grandfather, no home, no money, not a dollar to my name. A 12-year-old brother holding my hand and shaking like a leaf, and a woman in a doorway telling me I was nothing and never had been. I had exactly one thing in all the world, and it was so small I very nearly didn't think to reach for it. I had a key, 3 weeks before he died. When I was 14 and never dreaming he'd be gone within a month, Grandpa had pressed a key into my palm, an old brass key, worn smooth and warm from his pocket, and he closed my fingers around it with both of his big scarred hands. He'd looked at me with those pale eyes that had gone watery with age, but never once gone dim, and he'd said, slow, the way he said everything that mattered, Wren, you listen to me now, girl, and don't forget it. Things are going to get hard up here after I'm gone. Maybe harder than you can see coming from where you're standing. And when they do, when you don't know what else in this world to do, you go up to my shop. You go to the bench. There's a letter for you in the little black tin box in the cabinet under the lathe. You take that letter straight to Harlan Greer in town, and you don't let nobody stop you. You hear me? Not nobody. I'd said yes, Grandpa. The way a 14-year-old says yes to an old man's worrying without really hearing a word of it, and I'd taken a key home and dropped it in the bottom of my jewelry box and forgotten it clean for 2 years. It was in my jacket pocket that Tuesday. I'd grabbed it the night before, packing in the dark by flashlight while Sondra slept, some deep animal part of me reaching past all the things that matter for the one small thing that I had left in the world, not even knowing why. So when that man started up the hill with his bolt cutters, I let go of my brother's hand and I ran. I beat him to the door. I was younger and faster, and I knew the ground, every root and rock of it, and I had the brass key out of my pocket and into that lock and the hasp thrown open, and the two of us inside before the man even rightly understood what was happening. I slammed the door and through the iron slide bolt Grandpa kept on inside, the one he'd shoot to keep the door from banging in a wind, and I stood there with my back flat against the rough boards and my heart go like a trip hammer, breathing in for first time in 2 whole years the smell of that shop, high glue and shellac and spruce dust and the faint old sweetness of the linseed oil he'd rubbed into the surface of that workbench for half a century, and it was like falling backward into the arms of someone you thought was dead. Sondra was outside, pounding on the door with the flat of her hand, screaming that she'd call the sheriff, that we were trespassing on her property, that the building and everything in it was hers, and maybe a braver girl would have laughed at her through the door. I didn't have any laugh in me. I just turned around in the dim light and looked at what my grandfather had left behind, and the breath went clean out of my body. I'd been in that shop 1,000 times as a little child, but I had never once seen it the way I saw it that afternoon, with everything in the world to lose. There were instruments everywhere, hanging from the wall pegs in their flannel-lined canvas cases, stacked careful along the back of the bench, swinging gently from the rafters in cloth bags he'd sewn himself to keep the dust off, guitars, mandolins, 2 fiddles, and a long-necked thing he called a cittern that he'd built one winter just to prove himself he still could. More than a dozen finished instruments, hanging in the quiet like sleeping birds. I didn't know yet what they were worth. I only knew that they were beautiful, and that they were his, and that they were ours, and that a woman with a hired man and a pair of bolt cutters meant to feed every last one of them to a bonfire in the morning. And there under the lathe, in the cabinet, exactly where he'd told me it would be 2 years before, was a small black tin box, its lid japanned with faded pattern of gold leaves gone soft with age. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly work the little latch. Eli had come to stand beside me, gone dead quiet now, the way he got when a thing was too big to cry about. Inside the box was a thick envelope with my name written across the front in Grandpa's slow, careful hand. Just Wren, and beneath it, a folded stack of legal-looking papers held together with a rubber band gone brittle and cracked with the years. And beneath that, a cloth-bound ledger black, its spine gone soft and split from a lifetime of opening. I opened the letter first, sitting right down on the cold plank floor with my back against the cabinet, because my legs had stopped wanting to hold me. I'm going to tell you what it said, as near word for word as I can manage. because I have read that letter so many hundreds of times in the years since that the paper's gone soft as old cloth at every fold, and I could recite it in my sleep. Wren, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and things have got bad, just like I figured one day they might. I'm sorry I'm not there standing beside you. I'd give anything in this world to be. But I need you to know something right off before another minute passes. I did not leave you and your brother with nothing. I left you with everything I had, and I built it careful so that no one living could ever take it from you. This land has been Vance's land near on 200 years. My granddaddy's granddaddy cleared the bottom by the creek with a mule and his own 2 hands. I was not about to let it pass off to whoever your daddy happened to marry in his sorrow. God love that boy. They'll get sold off cheap to some fellow that wants to scrape our people's graves off the ridge and put up cabins for tourists. So a good while back now, I went into town and I sat down with Harlan Greer, and the 2 of us fixed it so it could never happen. This farm does not belong to your daddy. It never did, not the way folks naturally assume. Years ago, I put in what they call a trust. The whole 84 acres, the house, the shop, and every last thing inside it. And the 2 people that trust belongs to are you and Eli, and nobody else on God's green earth. Harlan Greer is the trustee, which is a word that means he holds it safe for you and minds it honest until the 2 of you are grown. Your daddy had every right to live here his whole life, and I wanted him to. This was his home, but he could not sell it, and he could not leave it to the soul, because it was never his to give away. That's the plain law of it. Harlan has all the papers, signed and witnessed and notarized and filed down at the courthouse just like they ought to be, where anybody could have gone and looked had they ever thought to. The trust holds the land. You take this letter and these copies I've kept for you, and you carry them straight to Harlan, and he will know exactly what to do. Don't you let anybody talk you out of it or scare you off of it. It is the law, and the law is on your side, child, all the way. Now I've got something else to tell you, so read close. The instruments handgin in this shop are not junk, no matter what anybody with no sense ever says about them. There's a man in Asheville, a dealer by the name of Royce Tilden. His card's tucked in the back of the ledger, and he's been after me 20 years to sell, and I never would. Some of these are worth more money than this whole family has seen at one time in 100 years of farming. The ledger tells what each one is, what went into it, and what Tilden last said it'd bring. Sell what you have to sell to keep you and your brother fed and warm and schooled. Keep what you can. Done right. They'll see the both of you grown and educated and never want in for anything, and you are the smartest, level-headedest child I ever in my life knew. So I am not worried about you doing it right. But here's the last thing I've got to say, and it's the most important of all, so you hold on to it. The money is not the gift. You hear me, Wren? The money is not the gift. The gift is in your 2 hands. You can build. I taught you, and you took to it better than any apprentice I ever had in 60 years, better than your own daddy ever did. God rest his soul, better than I dare hope. The number on my last finished label is 411. I want the 412th instrument that leaves this mountain to be yours. There's a guitar in the case on the far end of the bench. The cherry one, built from the wood I cut off our own hill the very year you were born. It ain't finished. I left it that way a purpose. I left it for you to finish, with your hands and not mine. And when you do, you glue your own name in that label, not mine. Because the legacy was never the lumber, and it was never the money. It's the knowing how, and that they cannot burn and they cannot sell, and they cannot put out on a porch in feed sacks. It is already yours. It is already in you. And no woman standing in a doorway can ever put you out of it, not as long as you live. I love you, girl. Mind your brother. The mountain's yours now. Make it sing. Grandpa. I read it through twice, and then I couldn't see the words on the page anymore for the water in my eyes. Eli had his hand wrapped around my arm, so tight it left marks. Outside, Sondra had stopped pounding on the door. I could hear her out there talking to the man, her voice gone shrill and uncertain in a way I had never once heard from her, and I heard her telling the hold-off to just wait a minute, that she was going to call the law and have the both of us hauled out, and somewhere in the cold quiet of that workshop, kneeling on the floor with my grandfather's voice still ringing the room, I understood the whole shape of it at last. She had no idea. None. She thought she had two scared children cornered in a falling-down shed. She did not know, she could not even have dreamed, that the two children in the shed had just been handed the deed to the very ground she was standing on. The mountain she meant to sell off to a stranger had belonged to Eli and me the entire time, since before she ever drove up our hill in her bright lipstick, and she had been, in the truest and most legal sense of the word, a guest in our house the whole while she'd been calling it hers. I picked the cherry guitar case up off the far end of the bench, my hand steadier now, and I laid it across the workbench where the light from the dusty window fell, and I opened the latches, and there was the unfinished guitar, the body built and braced and sanded glassy smooth, but the finish not yet laid on, raw cherry with the warm gold color of poured honey, cut from a tree that had grown its whole life on our own hill. In the same years, I'd been growing up beneath it, and in the headstock, up at the top where a maker sets his mark, my grandfather had inlaid one single shape in mother of pearl, gleaming soft against the dark, waiting in that case in the dark for 2 years for me to come and find it. A wren, a little bird, wings spread, caught mid-flight. My name, set in pearl by an old man's careful hands, left for me to find on the worst day of my life. That was the exact moment I stopped being afraid. Something in me just settled, the way a board settles once it's finally clamped true. I was still 16. I was still standing in a freezing shed with a woman screaming for sheriff on the other side of the door. But I was not afraid anymore, and I have never, not once in all the years since, been that afraid again. We did not burn anything, and we did not go to any county home. What we did was wait, the two of us sitting on the workshop floor with the letter and the papers between us, until Sondra's telephoning finally brought the deputy she called up our hill, a young fellow named Tackett, who'd gone to school with my cousins and known our family his whole life. When he knocked, polite, and told us through the door that we needed to come on out now, I slid back the iron bolt and I opened the door, and before he could get a word out about trespassing, I put my grandfather's letter and a stack of papers right into his hands, and I said, "Sir, before you put my brother and me off this mountain, you need to read these. And then I believe you need to telephone Mr. Harlan Greer in town, because he's going to tell you the same thing these papers do." Deputy Tackett was no fool. He stood right there in the workshop doorway, and he read that letter, his lips moving a little, and then he thumbed to the papers slow, and I watched his face change degree by degree, and when he got to the bottom of the last page, he looked up at Sondra, who was standing there in the yard with her arms crossed, certain she'd won, and he said, "Careful as a man stepping on creek rocks. Ma'am, I think before anybody goes anywhere, we'd best get Harlan Greer on the phone." Harlan Greer was the oldest practicing lawyer in the county, and very near the oldest man in it. A stooped, white-headed fellow with a voice like gravel rolling in a creek bed, who kept a one-room office above the hardware store in town since before my own daddy was born. He'd half retired by then, and didn't get around the way he once had. And he hadn't even heard that my father had passed, because Sondra had pushed the burial through so fast and quiet that the news hadn't reached the old man up in his office. But when Deputy Tackett got him on the phone and read him just a few lines off the top of those papers, there was a long silence on the line, and then old Harlan Greer said he would get in his car, and that nobody, he made the deputy promise it, nobody was to remove one child or one stick of property from that mountain until he got there. He drove out to our hill himself, slow, in a sedan older than my brother, and he climbed up to that workshop with a cane in one hand and a worn leather folder under the other arm, stopping twice to catch his breath, an old man laboring up a steep hill to keep a promise he'd made to a friend who was 9 years in the ground. And what happened next I will treasure until I am as old as he was that day. He laid it all out at the kitchen table. Our kitchen table, in our house, the same table where Grandpa had sat with Daddy on 1,000 evenings. Sondra stood at the counter with her arms crossed and her bright lipstick gone thin and pale at the edges, and Deputy Tackett stood by the door with his hat in his hands, and Eli and I sat across from the old lawyer, while he opened his leather folder and set the documents down on the oilcloth one at a time. Like a man laying down cards he already knows are winning, and explained each one in that slow gravel voice, slow enough that even a grieving child could follow it, slow enough that a stepmother who had never once been told the truth could not pretend she didn't understand it now. "This here," he said, settling a thick stapled document onto the table and tapping it with one bent finger, "is the Vance Family Trust, drawn up by my own hand, signed by Asa Vance, witnessed by two parties whose names are right there at the bottom and notarized, going on 9 years ago now. He laid the next one down beside it. And this is the deed. It transfers a home tract, 84 acres more or less, described by metes and bounds right here for the survey, from Asa Vance as an individual into that trust. And it was recorded down at the Mitchell County Register of Deeds here. See, deed book and page number printed right across the top, where anybody on earth could have driven into town and looked it up, had it ever once crossed their mind to wonder. He looked up over his glasses, mild as milk. The trust holds this land. This land was not, and never has been, any part of Wade Vance's estate. Not 1 square foot of it. Sondra found her voice. She said the deed had to be some kind of mistake. She said Wade had owned this place, that everybody knew it, that she'd seen the tax bills herself with his name printed right on them. Tax bills go to whoever's living on the property and paying the county, Greer said, and there was no meanness in it all. Just the patience of man explaining something to a child who hadn't had the chance to learn it. Paying the property tax does not make a person the owner, ma'am, any more than paying rent makes a renter the landlord. Now, Wade did have a real and honest legal interest in this place. It's called a life estate. It gave him every right to live here, work here, call home his whole life long. And he did, and Asa wanted it that way. It was his son. But a life estate is exactly what the name says it is. It lasts for a life, and it ends completely and forever the moment that life does. The day Wade Vance passed, God rest him, his entire interest in this property ended right along with his heartbeat. There was nothing left over for a widow to inherit. You cannot inherit a thing, ma'am, that ceased to exist the very instant a man drew his last breath. There was simply nothing there for it to land on. He laid the last page down on top of the others, gentle, like he was tucking in a child. And the people who own this trust, the beneficiaries in the language of the law, are Wren Vance and Eli Vance. These 2 children here, Asa's grandchildren. I am the trustee, which means the duty falls to me to hold this property and manage it honest and careful for their sole benefit until they come of age. Then the old lawyer turned his head and looked square at Sondra over the top of his glasses, and that gravel voice was dropped down low and soft, and somehow soft was worse than any shout could have been. Which means, ma'am, that the 2 children you stacked up on the porch in feed sacks this afternoon and ordered off this hill are the sole and rightful owners of every acre, every building, every board, and every nail of this property. And that you, by my reading of the law, and I have read it 60 years, are the only person presently standing on this mountain who has no legal right to be here at all. I have watched weather come over the mountain my whole life. I've seen a clear blue afternoon turn to slate and thunder in the time it takes to bring the washing off the line. I watched the very same thing pass over Sondra's face at that kitchen table. The hardness she'd worn like armor for 2 solid years just slid off her all at once. And what was underneath it was not anger. It was not the cold triumph I braced myself for. It was terror. Plain, naked animal terror. Because here's the thing I came to understand, sitting in that kitchen chair watching her face come apart. Sondra had never once in her whole life felt safe. 2 husbands gone before their time, a childhood down in the city she would never speak a word about, a woman pushing 50 with no money of her own, no people of her own, no place of her own to stand, who had married a sad, sinking mountain man for the only scrap of security she thought the world would ever let her have. A house, some land, a roof that was finally, after a whole hard life, going to be hers. And in the space of about 3 minutes, an 80-year-old man with a cane and a leather folder had explained to her, kindly, that it had never been hers at all, not for one single day, that she had just thrown the true owners out into the frost, and that she had nothing once again, exactly the way she had nothing every other time the floor had dropped out from under her. The grabbing, the sharpness, the bonfire she threatened. I understood, finally, sitting there, that all of it had been the thrashing of a person who had been drowning her entire life and had grabbed hold of our family's mountain, because she mistook it for solid ground. It did not excuse her. I need to be plain about that, because I was 16 years old, and she had put my baby brother out in the killing frost over a lie she'd told herself. Understanding why a person does a cruel thing is not the same as forgiving the cruel thing, and it is surely not the same as forgetting it ever happened. But sitting in that chair with my grandfather's letter folded in my jacket pocket and his little pearl Wren still glowing in my mind from the dark of the case up the hill, I found I had room enough in me for both things at once. The deep wound she had given Eli and me, and a strange, aching pity for whatever it was that had given that wound to her long before either of us was born. She did not fight any of it after that. There was nothing left to fight with, and somewhere in her she knew it. Mr. Greer told her, in that same patient gravel, that she would have 30 days to gather and remove her own personal belongings from the house, that she had no claim whatsoever to the real property or to anything held inside the workshop, and that if she so much as put a scratch on a single one of those instruments, he would personally see her prosecuted for the destruction of property held in trust for minor children, and that no judge in these mountains was going to look kindly on the woman who'd done it. She didn't argue. She turned without a word and walked back to bedroom. And after a while we could hear her in there packing, drawers sliding open and shut, and the sound of it was not, to me, the sound of a victory at all. It was just the sound of a person gathering up a life that hadn't worked out one more time. I was already old enough to know there is nothing in this world to celebrate in that, no matter who the person is or what they've done to you. The instruments were appraised 3 weeks later by the dealer from Asheville, the very Royce Tilden whose business card was tucked in the back of Grandpa's black ledger, just where the letter said it would be. He drove up our hill in a clean gray station wagon, and he walked into that workshop, and I stood in the doorway and watched the grown man take his hat off his head like he'd just stepped into a church. He went down the row of hanging instruments slow, lifting each one down with both hands like it might be made of eggshell, turning it to catch the light from the window, holding it close to read the little paper label in my grandfather's hand to the sound hole. At one point, he sat himself down on Grandpa's worn stool with guitar laid across his knees, and he didn't even play it, he just held it, his eyes gone bright and wet, and he said, mostly to himself and partly to the empty room, I told him. 20 years I told that man the whole wide world deserved to know what he could do. Stubbornest, finest old man I ever met. There were 14 finished instruments hanging in that shop. When Royce Tilden finally set his appraisal down on paper, it was a number with so many digits in it that I made Mr. Greer read it out to me twice over to be certain I had it right. And then I sat down. Asa Vance, it turned out, had been quietly known among the small circle of people who truly knew such things as one of the very finest makers in all the southern mountains. His work spoken with a hush in the same breath as names I would later learn to say with reverence. The dusty old guitars and mandolins hanging in that shed Sondra called a junk pile were worth, all told, more money than 4 generations of ancestors had pulled out of that hard hillside with their hands. Some of them, in time, I sold through Tilden to players and collectors who wept to own them. Some of them I kept and keep to this day. Every dollar went into the trust, and Mr. Greer minded it as honest as the day is long, and it saw Eli and me grown, fed, warm, and in time educated, the both of us, just exactly the way Grandpa had promised in his letter, down to the very last word. We never wanted for a thing again. The black ledger turned out to be its own kind of inheritance, separate from the money and almost separate from the instruments themselves. On the long evenings that first winter, I'd sit by the wood stove in our front room and read it cover to cover, again and again, the way other girls my age read novels. It was a whole record of his working life, 60 years of it. Every instrument set down in order in his slow, square hand. Number 1, a fiddle, built when he was 19 for a girl he didn't marry. Numbers along through the war years when good wood was near impossible to come by, and he wrote little notes in the margins about using salvage crating spruce and being half ashamed of it. The guitar he built for Burl Sizemore, number 26, with B.S., paid in a hog and a winter's firewood written beside it, which made me laugh out loud alone in the room. He noted the wood of each one, where it came from, which were cut off our own hill and which he traded for a Brazilian rosewood back he'd gotten in 1961, and saved 11 years before he found the instrument worthy of it. He noted who he sold to, and sometimes a word or two about them, and you could read his whole quiet opinion of a person in 3 words. And near the back, in handwriting that had gone shakier in his last years, he'd begun keeping notes about me. Wren did the rosette on 408, clean as I could have. Wren's inlay better than mine now, won't tell her. I read that line by the wood stove and had to set the book down a while. He had been keeping a record of me the whole time, the way he kept a record of everything he loved and meant to last. That ledger told me more about who my grandfather truly was in all the years I'd spent sitting under his bench, and I keep it now in the same cabinet under the lathe, and I have kept my own count going in the back of it ever since. But you already know the money was never the gift, because the old man told me so in his own hand, and because I told you so myself at the start of this. The gift was in my two hands. He'd said it, and he was right, the way he was right about wood and weather and people and just about everything else. Eli and I did not go off to any county home, and we did not go begging at the doors of distant cousins who'd half forgotten our names. We went, by the grace of God and the plain goodness of plain people, across the road and up the next rise, to Burl and Etta Sizemore, who had been my grandfather's nearest neighbors and dearest friends for better than 50 years. They'd grown up alongside Asa, gone to the one-room school with him, and Burl had bought the very first guitar Asa Vance ever sold for money and kept it hanging on the wall of their front room like a holy relic for half a century. When the dust finally settled and Mr. Greer set about finding someone fit and willing to take guardianship of 2 orphaned children, he hadn't even finished asking the question before Etta Sizemore was already setting 2 more places at her supper table. "Why, those young uns have eat at this table since they was big enough to sit up in a chair," she said, like the lawyer had asked her something foolish. "Reckon they can just keep right on." Burl, who was a man of even fewer words than my grandfather had been, which is saying a great deal, walked across the road that same evening in the falling dark and helped me carry the feed sacks and the 2 liquor boxes back up our own porch steps and into our own front room. He set them down careful, and he looked around the house a moment, and then he looked at me and he said, "Ace'd want this place lived in, not standing empty. You and the boy'll stay up here in your own home where you belong. Etta and me'll be right across the road, close enough to holler if you need us, day or night." He stopped, and his jaw worked a second, and then he said, "You ain't alone, Wren. Don't you ever once let yourself think it." And then he wiped his eyes rough with the back of his hand, and pretended like he hadn't, and bid me good night, and walked back home in the dark. That is how we came up. 2 children in our own house on our own mountain, with the Sizemores keeping a watchful eye from across the road, and an old country lawyer keeping a watchful eye over the trust, and the workshop standing at the very top of the hill with the padlock hanging open at last and the light coming back into it after 2 long years of dark. Because I went up there every single day after school the whole first long year, and then the years after, I climbed the hill and I unlocked the door and I sat myself down at my grandfather's bench, and I picked up exactly where he had set things down. The first thing I did was finish the mandolin he'd had in the clams the morning he died. I'll tell you, my hand shook bad the first time I touched it, taking up a job a dead man had laid down, finishing the sentence he never got to end. I dressed its frets the way he'd taught me, and I rubbed in its finished coat by coat, slow, no hurrying it, because the wood remembers, and I strung it up, and the first time I drew my arm across those strings, a sound that rose up out of it filled that whole little room, and went pouring out the open window, and rolling down the hill into blue evening. And I swear before God and my grandfather both that I felt him standing right behind me in that moment, not saying a word, just watching, just nodding once, slow, the way he did when a thing was too good to need talking about. And then when I was ready, when I felt my hand were finally good enough, I started it on the cherry guitar, number 412, the one he'd built from a tree cut off our own hill the year I came into the world, the one with my little pearl Wren waiting in the headstock. I took my time over it. I was learning still, and I made my mistakes, and I fixed every one of them slow and honest, no shortcuts, no patches, because as he always said, you cannot hurry the wood, and you cannot hurry much else that's worth a thing. It took me the better part of 2 years to finish that guitar the way it deserved to be finished. And when I finally did, when I'd rubbed the last coat of varnish down to a deep warm glow and strung it, and brought up the pitch and held it across my knee in the very same spot where Royce Tilden had sat hold of my grandfather's work like a man in church, I did the one last thing the letter had told me to do. I made a label, a little square of good paper, lettered in my own hand, as careful and true as I knew how to make it. And I did not write his name on it. I wrote my own, Wren Vance, and the town and the year and the number, 412, taking up his count exactly where his hand had laid it down, because the line was not broken. It had only passed, the way everything that matters passes. out of an old man's hands and into a young woman's. I glued that label down inside the sound hole, in the dark where it would live out its whole life and only ever be seen by some person far off in the future who loved the instrument enough to turn it to the light and look. And I have never in all my life since been prouder of any single thing that I have done. I am a luthier now. That is my trade, the proper word and all. I build stringed instruments in my grandfather's workshop on my grandfather's mountain in Mitchell County, North Carolina, and people come from far off to climb the hill and buy them, just exactly the way they came for him, and when they asked me about the little Wren and laid in the headstock of every one, because I set one into every instrument I build, the same way he signed his with that paper label, the way every maker leaves a piece of their own self in the work. I tell them it was my grandfather's name for me, and I tell them that he gave me a name and a trade and a home and a whole mountain, all of it sealed up inside one falling down shed that a frightened woman once swore she was going to burn to the ground. Eli grew up tall and good and easy in his skin. He works the bottom land down by the creek and runs a small herd of cattle on the cleared parts of the hill. And between the two of us, we keep the 84 acres the way the Van Cess always have, the way Grandpa wanted. Our great-grandparents and our parents and our grandfathers still sleep undisturbed in the little fenced plot at the edge of the woods, under the dogwoods that bloom white every spring like the mountain's own quiet promise. There are no vacation cabins. There was never any bonfire. There is just a farm and the work, and the mountain doing the one thing the mountain has always done, which is to outlast every trouble that ever climbs its slopes and keep right on. I saw Sondra only one more time in my life. It was years later in the grocery store in town. She was older and somehow smaller, the way people get, and she saw me coming down the aisle, and I watched her try to decide whether to turn away and pretend she hadn't. And then she didn't turn away. She came up to me instead, and she stood there a moment, working up to it, and she said, "I heard you do real well with the guitars." I told her I did, and she looked at me with a face that finally, somewhere in the long years between, stopped pretending to be hard, and she said very low, "I'm sorry, Wren, for the children, for what I did to 2 children put out in the cold." And then she said the truest thing she ever said to me, the thing I believe now she'd been carrying around like a stone in her chest the whole time. I was scared. I was scared my whole life long, and I let being scared make me cruel, and that's the worst of it. I'm sorry. I could have said any number of things to her. There was a 16-year-old still living somewhere inside of me who badly wanted to. But my grandfather had taught me, with his hands, his quiet, and his whole long life, that you do not ever have to become the thing that hurt you, and that grace, the real kind, never costs you a single thing you cannot spare. So I told her the truth, which was that I forgave her, and that I understood now what fear could do to a person if they let it, and that I hoped with my whole heart she had found some solid ground at last to stand on. She cried right there by the canned goods, an old woman cry in a grocery store, and then she nodded and pushed her cart on, and I never saw her again in this life. I hope she's all right, wherever she is. I mean that fully. The mountain made me big enough, in the end, to mean it. The first instrument I ever sold on my own went out the door the spring I turned 19. A young fiddle player drove up from over in Tennessee, 3 hours of mountain road, because somebody at convention had told him there was a Vance making instruments up on the Toe River again. He'd half expected, I think, to find an old man, and instead he found me, a girl barely out of high school in a flannel shirt with rosewood dust in my hair. I watched the doubt cross his face plain as weather, and I didn't say anything about it. I just took down the fiddle I'd built that winter, maple back, a spruce top off a tree from the high cove, the scroll cut clean, and I handed it to him and let it do the talking, the way Grandpa always let the work do the talking. He tucked it under his chin out on the porch in the cool spring air and drew the bow across, and I saw his whole face change. I had watched that change happen to strangers 100 times as a little girl hiding under the bench, and I had never once been the one to cause it. And standing there at 19 watching it happen because of something my own hands had made, I understood at last that the trade had not died with my grandfather. It had only gone quiet for 2 years, holding its breath in a sealed shed, waiting for my hands to be ready. The young man paid me what I asked without a word of haggling, and as he drove back down the hill with my fiddle on the seat beside him, I sat down on the porch step, and I cried, But it was a different kind of crying than the kind I'd done in the frost 3 years before. It was the kind that means a thing has come back around right. Eli never took to the building. He tried a season or two to please me, but his hands were made for the land the way mine were made for the wood, and there is no shame in that. It takes both kinds to keep a place alive. He grew up steady and broad-shouldered and easy, the kind of man who can fix any engine and read a sky and never says 3 words where one will do. He brought the tobacco bottom back into shape and put in hay and ran a little herd of black cattle on the clear ground, and the 2 of us settled into the farm like 2 halves of the same tool. The day we both came of age and Mr. Greer turned the trust over into our own hands, free and clear, the old lawyer drove out one last time and laid the papers on the kitchen table and had us sign them, his hand trembling now over the pen. And when it was done, he sat back and looked at the 2 of us a long moment and said, "Well, Asa knew what he was doing. He always did." Eli signed his name slow and careful, and then he stood up and looked out the window at the hill running up the workshop, and he said the longest thing I think I'd ever heard him say. He said, "She thought this place was worth a bonfire, and it had already been worth more than her whole life, the whole time she was standing on it. People don't see what's right under 'em." Then he put his hat on and went out to feed the cattle, and that was Eli's whole sermon on the subject, start to finish, and I have never heard it said better. Burl Sizemore lived long enough to hear me sell a dozen instruments, and then one hard January he laid down for an afternoon nap in his chair by the wood stove and didn't wake from it, the same gentle way my grandfather had gone, and the mountain lost one more of its quiet good men. We buried him on a gray day with the ground frozen, so hard the diggers had to work at it, and half the county came, because that is what the mountain does for its own. A week after the funeral, Etta walked across the road and up our hill, slow, leaning on a stick now herself, and she was carrying something wrapped in an old quilt. It was the guitar Burl had bought for my grandfather more than 50 years before, number 26 in the ledger, paid for, the book said, with a hog and a winter's worth of firewood. Etta pressed it into my arms and closed my hands around it the same way Grandpa had closed my hands around the key, and she said, "Burl wanted this to come home to the bench it was born on. He said you'd know what to do with it." I took it up to the shop, and I cleaned it and reset its neck and brought it back to life, and I hung it on the wall beside the cherry guitar, the first instrument of Ace's to come home, and the last one he ever meant for me, side by side, and on the still evenings I'll take one or the other down and play, and the 2 of them sound like one voice across the years. And then there came the day, when I was past 30 and gray was starting to show at my temples, that I took an apprentice of my own. Her name was Junie, Burl and Etta's great-granddaughter, a quiet, watchful child who used to follow Etta across the road and end up in my shop, planting herself on the floor under my bench and going still as a held breath, watching my hands. I knew that stillness. I had invented that stillness, sitting under another bench in the same room 30 years before. One afternoon, without either of us making a thing of it, I reached down and handed her a long curl of spruce shaven the way my grandfather had handed them down to me, and she took it like it was made of gold, and I understood that the line was reaching forward again, out past me, the way it had reached forward from a lonely old German man with no children to a quiet mountain boy named Asa, and from Asa down to a girl named Wren, and now from Wren down to a child named Junie, who could not yet see over the top of the workbench. I taught her to clamp braces while the glue set. I taught her to file a fret, so it would never catch the heel of a hand. I told her, when she rushed a job and split a piece of binding, that you cannot hurry the wood, and you cannot hurry much else that's worth a thing. And I made her do over slow, and I stood right there until she did it right, exactly the way it had been done for me. Wood remembers, I told her. And so, it turns out, do people, if somebody takes the care to teach them. Sometimes on a Sunday, I climb up the cove to the little fence plot at the edge of the woods where they all lie under the dogwoods. My great-grandparents, my mother, my father, and my grandfather has stoned the plainness of the lot, because he'd have wanted it that way. I pull the weeds, and I set the fallen flowers right, and I sit down on the cool grass, and I tell him how it all came out. The way you tell anybody. I tell him the shop is busy, and the orders are backed up a year. I tell him Eli's cattle are fat, and the bottom made good hay. I tell him I finished 412, and I'm well past 500 now, my own count climbing right up out of back of his ledger. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.